Imagine for a second that you have a completely flawless driving record. I mean, like 14 straight years without a single speeding ticket.
Right. No fender benders, nothing.
Yeah, not even a parking violation. And then one morning, you back out of your driveway, try to stop at the end of your street, and you just plow straight into a brick wall.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The state police show up, they write you a massive citation for reckless driving, and they, publicly tell the whole town you're a danger to society.
Which is crazy.
It is, because the catch is the state secretly snuck into your garage the night before and completely removed the brakes from your car.
Wow.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Today is Thursday, April 2, 2026, and I know yesterday was April Fool's Day.
Right, everyone's on high alert for pranks.
Exactly, you probably saw your fair share of, illusions online. But the massive stack of data we are looking at today contains a financial sleight of hand that is very, very real.
Oh, absolutely.
It is an illusion currently being performed by the state of Washington. And the audience, which in this case is the entire public school system, is going bankrupt right before our eyes.
Yeah, and the sheer scale of the illusion is really what makes this data stack so compelling. We are pulling from a really diverse array of sources today to get the full picture.
We've got a lot to get through.
We do. We have forensic audit data from the state itself, actual legislative receipts and bill texts, and some fascinating internal strategy notes from a grassroots advocacy coalition.
Right, the rural school districts.
Yeah, they call themselves PAC 295.
And our mission today really is to look at the massive gap between the public relations narrative and the actual math.
Which are completely at odds.
Completely. The state of Washington is currently, publicly blaming local school districts for severe financial mismanagement.
That's the official story, yeah.
But we are going to look at the receipts to see how the state is simultaneously passing laws that literally alter the concepts of space and time.
I know that sounds insane, but they really are.
It does. They're doing it to mask a $15.5 billion state funding default.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this state narrative of local mismanagement is incredibly loud right now.
It's everywhere.
You have several Washington school districts facing multi-million-dollar deficits. Some are, on the brink of being dissolved entirely.
Right.
And the state's message to the taxpayers is essentially, well, these local school boards have poor internal controls. They're just bad at managing their checkbooks.
Right. But the forensic reality tells a completely different story. And honestly, the most damning piece of evidence against the state's narrative comes from their own internal watchdog.
The auditor, right.
Yeah, the state auditor's office, or the SAO.
Sure.
The PAC 295 coalition put together what they call the Audit Scorecard based on these state audits.
Which I was looking at earlier.
And it completely dismantles the claim of local mismanagement.
Yeah, I was looking at this scorecard, and it is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. Let's look at Battleground School District as the prime example here. Okay, so Battleground is basically the fiscal equivalent of a straight-A student.
Okay.
They currently hold a 14-year streak of perfectly clean audits from the state.
14 years.
14 years. The SAO has combed through their ledgers year after year and found zero material weaknesses. No findings of fraud, no waste, no abuse, nothing.
So the state auditor is actively confirming that their operational management is flawless.
Exactly. Yet despite being a model of financial efficiency, Battleground is facing a structural funding gap of $20 million.
Wait, I'm stuck on something here. If I'm getting straight A's on my financial report card from the state's own auditor,
Right.
What exactly is the state legislature using as proof of mismanagement? I mean, are they just completely ignoring their own auditor to push this narrative?
Well, to borrow your earlier analogy, the state didn't just remove the brakes. They are actively charging the district for the damage to the bumper.
Unbelievable.
The state uses the sheer existence of a budget deficit as proof of mismanagement, regardless of how that deficit was created. Look at Mabton, for instance.
Mabton is a tiny school district, right?
Very tiny. And they have a long-term streak of completely clean audits, too. But in June 2025, the state forced them into what they call binding conditions.
Which is bad.
It's essentially state receivership for insolvency. And it was triggered simply because their fund balance evaporated.
So how does that happen? How does a perfectly managed district just go bankrupt?
To understand that, we have to look at the specific audit terminology the SAO uses.
Break that down for me. What is the actual language in these audits that proves the locals aren't at fault?
So the auditor evaluates two distinct things. First, they look at your controls.
Okay.
A district like Mabton receives a clean controls rating. That means your internal management, your bookkeeping, your oversight, all of it is mathematically flawless.
You're tracking every single penny perfectly.
You're doing everything right. But simultaneously, that exact same auditor can attach a going concern label to your district.
And going concern is basically corporate audit speak for you might not be able to keep the lights on next year.
That's the crux of it. A going concern warning means you are mathematically headed toward insolvency.
I see.
When a district receives an audit that explicitly praises their flawless internal controls but still labels them a going concern, it is mathematical proof that the crisis is entirely external.
Right, because you can't budget your way out of a deficit if the incoming revenue is fundamentally lower than the mandatory operating costs.
Exactly. The local district isn't mismanaging the money. The state is simply failing to provide enough of it.
So if the local districts are managing the funds perfectly, but they are still millions of dollars in the hole, the money has to be going somewhere else. Like someone turned off the faucet.
They absolutely did. The sources refer to this systemic budgetary shift as the Great Default.
The Great Default.
Yeah. And to understand the mechanics of it, we have to rewind to a landmark state Supreme Court case in 2019. It's known as the McCleary Mandate.
Right, McCleary is a huge deal in Washington.
Huge. The state constitution in Washington explicitly designates the fully funded education of all children as the paramount duty of the state.
The paramount duty.
Yes. The Supreme Court found the legislature in contempt for failing that duty, and they forced them to inject billions into the public school system.
And that injection actually worked for a minute, right? I mean, the data shows that right after McCleary, K-12 education peaked at taking up 51.6% of the state's total general fund.
That's right.
So over half the state budget was going to schools, as the Constitution demands.
Right, but the compliance was short-lived. Once the immediate pressure of the court order faded, the legislature began quietly reprioritizing.
Yes, of course they did.
If we fast forward to the 2026 supplemental budget proposals we have in our data stack today, that share of the general fund dedicated to K-12 education plummeted to 42.2%.
Wow. That is nearly a 10% drop in the state's total budgetary commitment to its paramount duty.
And a 10% drop on a state budget scale is monumental.
Oh, I'm sure.
In real dollars, that equates to roughly $7 billion per biennium being systematically siphoned away from public education.
Just moving it to fund other state priorities.
Exactly. The legislature didn't lose the money. They deliberately moved it.
You know, it's really important to note, looking at these receipts, that this isn't a left-wing or right-wing issue for us today.
No, not at all.
We aren't here to, evaluate the political spin or endorse whatever new programs that $7 billion was redirected toward. We are strictly looking at the forensic ledgers.
Just the math.
Right, just the math. And the ledgers show a massive deliberate withdrawal of funds from the public school system. But a 10% drop is, it's an abstract statewide number.
Right.
How does the state actually implement that cut at the local level without explicitly passing a law saying, hey, we are cutting your funding?
That's the clever part. They do it through a mechanism called the prototypical school model.
Okay.
On paper, this is the state's mathematical formula for determining exactly how much money a school should need to operate.
Okay, sounds reasonable enough.
But the internal notes from PAC 295 accurately label it prototypical fiction.
Fiction.
Yeah, it's a spreadsheet fantasy that intentionally ignores the realities of the actual market.
Let's use the Prescott School District as our real-world receipt here. How does a prototypical fiction spreadsheet actually starve a living, breathing school district?
Well, the state distributes funds based on incredibly rigid expenditure categories called objects, which are numbered 0 through 9.
Okay.
And the state's formula structurally underfunds the actual real-world costs in almost every single object category.
Give me an example.
Take Object 2, for example, which covers certificated salaries.
Meaning your teachers.
Exactly. The state calculates funding based on a hypothetical average teacher salary. But to actually hire a qualified math teacher in the competitive real-world market, Prescott has to pay the going market rate.
Right.
As a result, the state formula shorts Prescott by $145,000 just on basic teacher salaries alone.
Which is an impossible scenario for a local school board. You can't just hire 70% of a math teacher because the state only sends 70% of the required salary.
Right, you have to hire the whole teacher.
Exactly, which means the district immediately goes into the red.
And the bleeding continues down the ledger.
Yeah.
Object 4 covers employee benefits. The state formula shorts Prescott by $80,000 there.
Good grief.
Then there's Object 7, purchase services, which includes basic utilities. The state provides a flat, abstract estimate for utilities, completely ignoring the reality that rural districts often face significantly higher utility rates.
Right, and they operate older, less efficient buildings.
Exactly. So Prescott is shorted $65,000 every year just to keep the lights on and the classrooms heated.
So when you add up all these structural deficits across objects 0 through 9, what does the final math look like for a tiny rural district like Prescott?
It creates an unyielding structural gap of about $475,000 every single year.
Wow.
So when the state publicly shames Prescott for accumulating a $1.5 million debt and accuses them of gross mismanagement, the forensic math tells the real story.
Because if the state structurally underfunds your mandatory operating costs by nearly $500,000 a year, it takes exactly 36 months to hit a $1.5 million debt.
Exactly. They aren't mismanaging anything.
They're literally just existing for 3 years.
Right. And when you scale that intentional structural gap across all 295 districts in the state of Washington, this systemic withdrawal is bleeding public schools at a rate of $57.87 every single second.
Of every single day. So if a local district can't cut any more corners, and they can't magically print their own money to cover that $57 a second gap, what happens when they finally hit the absolute bottom of the barrel?
We actually have a historical precedent for exactly that scenario, and it is bleak. The sources refer to it as the Vader Hole.
The Vader Hole.
Back in 2007, Washington used to have 296 school districts. But the Vader School District completely collapsed financially under the weight of these structural gaps.
It just couldn't keep up.
No. So the state stepped in, formally dissolved the Vader District, and erased it from the map. Washington went from 296 districts down to 295.
Wow.
And to handle the displaced students, the state forced a neighboring district, Castle Rock, to annex the Vader territory.
Logically, you would assume that if the state forces a neighboring district to take on an entire collapsed town's worth of students, they would provide a massive influx of emergency funding to that rescuing district.
You would think so, but the reality is the exact opposite. By absorbing Vader, Castle Rock unwittingly became the state's unpaid contractor for rural education.
Unpaid.
Yes, and it all comes down to the mechanics of the state's transportation formula.
How does absorbing a town bankrupt the transportation budget?
Because the state formula severely underfunds the actual cost of running buses in rural, geographically dispersed areas.
Okay, that makes sense.
Castle Rock inherited this massive new physical footprint, the Vader Zone. It requires driving heavy school buses for thousands of extra miles over rural roads, which burns massive amounts of fuel and destroys vehicle suspensions.
Ah, man.
But the state doesn't fully reimburse those actual costs. Over the last 19 years, simply because they stepped in to absorb the Vader Zone, Castle Rock has been forced to absorb a cumulative $4.5 million transportation deficit.
That is staggering. They were financially penalized for stepping in to fix the state's mess.
Yes.
I mean, every single dollar Castle Rock has to spend on extra bus fuel for the Vader Zone is a dollar actively stolen from a classroom inside Castle Rock.
Exactly. And the Vader story is a chilling precedent, especially when we look at the immediate present. Because just this year, the Prescott School District almost suffered the exact same fate.
They were next.
They were inches away from becoming the 294th district.
This is where the sheer desperation in these documents really jumps out at me. In January 2026, State Superintendent Chris Rakedahl filed a formal legal petition to dissolve the Prescott School District.
Yeah.
The state handed this small community a drop-dead deadline of April 1st, 2026, which, again, was literally yesterday.
Right.
The ultimatum was simple. Prove you are financially viable on your own, or you will be erased, your kids will be shipped to neighboring towns, and your community identity will cease to exist.
And it is vital to note that the state offered zero rescue funds to help them meet that deadline. Prescott had to engineer their own survival. They essentially paid a ransom to the state.
A ransom they paid by cannibalizing their own community. To satisfy the state's ledger by yesterday's deadline, the local taxpayers had to pass a supplemental local levy with an unheard-of 90% approval rating.
90% is incredible.
They were taxing themselves twice for the same basic education the state is constitutionally required to provide. Then they scraped together $30,000 in local community bake sale style fundraising.
Which is heartbreaking.
And in the most devastating move of all, the school board was forced to sell their century-old teacher's cottage to the city for $380,000.
Just to survive. The petition was actually just rescinded 7 days ago, on March 25th.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the dynamic is deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
A massive state institution is holding a rural community's identity hostage. They're actively forcing local taxpayers to liquidate their own historical, physical assets just to fund the bare minimum required to keep a school open.
But selling off a historic 100-year-old building is a desperate, one-time parlor trick.
Right, you can only sell the town's furniture once.
Exactly. Once the money from the cottage is gone, that $57 a second structural bleed is still there.
Yes, it is.
So how does the state legislature actually attempt to solve this ongoing deficit at a systemic level? Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the legislature doesn't fix the math.
Yeah, they don't.
They literally pass laws to change the definitions of reality.
The legislative gymnastics are incredible to read. Let's start with how the state legally bends the concept of physical space.
Okay.
In that prototypical model we discussed earlier, the state's legal definition of basic education completely excludes the actual physical building where the education takes place.
Wait, I need to make sure I am hearing you correctly.
Okay.
The physical school building, the roof, the walls, the heating system is legally not considered part of basic education.
That is correct. In the state's formula, the physical building falls under Object 9 capital outlay. The state considers the physical space to be an optional local enhancement. Optional. As a result, they provide virtually $0 for ongoing maintenance, structural repairs, or capital improvements. The entire burden of keeping the roof from caving in falls strictly on the local community's ability to pass supermajority construction bonds.
So the state's definition of fulfilling its paramount duty is paying for a portion of a teacher and a textbook, but the students are legally expected to just sit in an open field in the rain.
Essentially, yes. And we saw exactly how this loophole is weaponized in the Vader collapse.
Right.
The state structurally starved the district, refused to provide any maintenance funds, and eventually the Vader school building's roof literally collapsed. The building was condemned.
Oh my God.
The state then turned around and used the condemned status of the building as the primary legal justification to dissolve the district entirely.
So space is ignored by the state until its absence can be used as a weapon against the local community.
Precise.
That is institutional gaslighting at its finest. So that is how the legislature bends space. Now, explain this time warp bill to me, because the mechanics of this one blew my mind.
Oh, this one is wild. During the 2026 legislative session, the state was looking for ways to trim their budget. So they passed ESSB 6260.
Okay.
They needed to save $21.1 million, so they literally waved a legislative wand and redefined the laws of physics regarding the lifespan of school buses.
Wait, they didn't allocate money to build better, longer-lasting buses?
No.
They just took out a pen and changed the expiration date of metal and engines on paper.
Exactly. By legislative decree, small buses went from an expected safe lifespan of 8 years up to 10 years. Large buses were legally extended from 13 years to 15 years.
But what does changing that number on a piece of paper actually do to the budget?
It artificially delays the state's required depreciation payments to the local districts.
Ah.
The state simply stops paying its share for bus replacements for an extra 2 years, claiming the existing buses are legally fine, but rust and engine failure do not care about a state bill.
Right.
Older buses break down more frequently and catastrophically, so the state successfully saves $21.1 million on their own ledger. But they accomplished it by forcing local district mechanics to shoulder the financial maintenance risk. And far more importantly, they forced local communities to shoulder the safety risk of putting children in aging vehicles.
They just lied to the clock to save $20 million.
Pretty much.
And if they can't afford to replace the buses and the state won't give them the money for new ones, how are these desperate districts supposed to keep the fleets running? That brings us to another legislative trick they just passed, SB 6065.
SB 6065 is the ultimate financial shell game, and the timing of its passage is no coincidence. It was passed just in time to offer a false lifeline before Prescott's April 1st survival deadline.
Wow.
The bill allows districts that are in the red zone, meaning they are facing imminent insolvency, to take interest-free loans from their own transportation vehicle fund and move that cash directly into their general operating fund.
Okay, let's unpack this. The transportation vehicle fund is highly restricted money. That is the cash you are legally required to save up to buy new, safe buses when the old ones die.
Exactly. The state passed a law legally allowing desperate districts to raid their own children's bus safety money just to pay for things like math teachers and the electric bill.
That's horrifying.
They are forcing local boards to sacrifice student transport safety to mask the state's failure to fund the general budget.
Wow.
And the state frames this bill as a generous lifeline to struggling districts. But borrowing from your own safety reserves isn't a solution. It's a slow-motion liquidation.
Right.
In 2 years, when the bus dies, the fund will be empty, and you still won't be able to afford the math teacher.
It's a trap disguised as a life raft. And, what really exposes the state's deep hypocrisy regarding time is how they treat their own legal deadlines. We mentioned earlier that April 1st yesterday was the absolute unforgiving, drop-dead survival date for Prescott.
Yeah.
The state held a gun to their head over that date. But yesterday was also a critical, legally mandated emergency deadline for the state itself.
And the contrast is staggering. Under a recently passed tax credit bill, HB 2444, the State Department of Revenue was legally required to file a formal notification by April 1st to provide critical financial relief to these communities.
And what happened?
The state missed the deadline. They simply didn't file the paperwork.
So time is an absolute unforgiving master when a rural school district is fighting for its life. But time is just a mild, totally ignorable suggestion when the state has a legal obligation to act.
That is the ultimate dynamic of power at play here. When a massive institution writes the rules, they can redefine physical space to avoid paying for buildings. They can legally alter the aging process of a bus to save a buck. And they can completely ignore the clock when it doesn't suit them.
If you are listening to this and you don't live in Washington state, you might think you're safe from this kind of bureaucratic maneuver.
Oh, definitely not.
Right. But what the PAC 295 coalition is exposing here matters to everyone, because this is a masterclass in how massive institutions operate anywhere.
Absolutely.
It shows exactly how a central government can design a structural mathematical failure from the top down, launch a massive public relations campaign, blaming local management to deflect accountability, and systematically force local taxpayers to subsidize the state's default by selling their own history and taxing themselves twice.
It's textbook.
It's a lesson in looking past the polished press releases. When a massive institution tells you a local community is failing because of bad management, you have to demand the actual forensic receipts.
And the ledgers tell an incredibly clear story here, and the conclusion is unavoidable. The PAC 295 coalition isn't a group of mismanaged districts crying wolf about their checkbooks.
No.
They are the canary in the coal mine for the entire public infrastructure. That $57 a second bleed is a $15.5 billion systemic withdrawal that actively penalizes local communities for simply doing their jobs and following the rules.
Right.
Flawless local management cannot save you from fundamentally broken math designed by the state.
The state's narrative is a meticulously crafted illusion, a massive sleight of hand. But the consequences for these small towns are devastatingly real.
Very real.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up today's dive. If a state's constitution explicitly mandates that basic education is its absolute paramount duty,
Right.
but fulfilling that duty realistically requires rural towns to literally sell off their historic town halls and quietly borrow against the physical safety of the buses carrying their children, what happens when there is simply nothing left to sell?